Welcome, Dr. Ian Young, to another episode of Revisiting Religion. So, Dr. Ian Young is an esteemed scholar of the Hebrew Bible and ancient languages. He serves as an honorary at the University of Sydney and is currently based at Australian Catholic University. His work bridges philology and theology, offering deep insight into the linguistic history and transmission of biblical text. Dr. Young has been teaching classical Hebrew and biblical studies since the late 1980s, and some of his notable works, amongst many, are Daniel, a textual commentary, linguistic datings of biblical texts, and historical linguistics and biblical Hebrew. So, Ian, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Yes, no, I'm really happy to be here. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, I guess for the audience who may be interested in learning more about the Hebrew Bible, in a nutshell, what would you say is the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, in terms of the definition, I use Hebrew Bible to refer to the scriptures that are also used by modern Jewish people as well. They're the same books that are in a Protestant Old Testament, but when you use the term Old Testament, it gets a lot more fuzzy because different churches have different contents in their Old Testament. There are in the Western world, even in a bookshop, if you pick up a Catholic Bible, it has all these extra books in it. But if you go further afield, one of my research interests is the first book of Enoch, which is only
Mm.
fully preserved by the Ethiopic Church, and we can thank them for that. They just didn't get the memo that no one else was using it anymore, and so
Yeah.
that's a distinction I'd make between Hebrew Bible as that sort of narrower group of books and much wider range of literature, which is held by various Christian denominations as their Old Testament.
I do notice that the Protestant canon, I guess, has roughly 66 books. The Catholics have, I think, 73, and then the Ethiopians have probably the most, I think, 80 something. So apart from the New Testament collection, would Jews consider, for example, the Ethiopian canon to be Word of God from a theologic perspective?
Generally, we're talking about the standard Judaism these days, then it's the Hebrew Bible. Those are the books they would consider to be scriptural. Jewish people, of course, would consider that other writings, like 1 Enoch, which is a collection of ancient Jewish writings as well, they would have respect for that because it is,
Yeah.
from their culture and background, but it wouldn't have the same status as
Mm.
that core group of books, Genesis,
Yeah.
etc., and the prophets, etc.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a clear distinction. Same way that like in the West, Protestant Christians will have that core group of Old Testament books, and they will to
Mm.
different ways they'll respect other books
Sure.
that are
Okay.
used by Christians, but they're not on the same level for them. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. When you look at the Hebrew Bible as a whole, what do you think that most people often misunderstand about what kind of book it actually is?
Yeah, I think the Bible's got this reputation as being like this book of rules and things from God, these decisions, etc., like that. And that I think the major thing to think about with the Hebrew Bible is that it willingly presents a range of different views on lots of topics and consciously goes out of its way to want you to think about these. And it's often create rather than telling you this is the answer. They regularly want to invite you into a conversation, so giving you multiple points of view on something. And quite often, even when they want to present the same thing, like I mean, in the book of Jeremiah, for example, there are multiple points of view on why did the exile happen? Why did we get taken away by the Babylonians into exile? In one chapter, it was all about the prophets failed. The next chapter, the priests failed. And the next one,
Mm.
it's the whole people, the king failed, and things like that. And they're laid next to each other. So the idea is it's a really complicated issue. But rather than what we tend to do in the West, which is we try to put things in a nutshell.
Yes.
Ancient Near Eastern people are very happy with presenting what, from our point of view, are contradictory ideas because they want to present a real range of ideas, which
Mm.
you could argue is maybe a more accurate way of reflecting reality, because reality is really complicated. And so,
Yeah.
one of the things I would say is the the Hebrew Bible wants to invite you to a conversation more than just telling you, well, here's
Yeah.
here's 10
Yeah.
commandments. Why not just continue and give, I don't know, thousands of commandments, and that's your whole the whole story. But And why tell stories? Why not just say, this is the point of the Abraham story? Here's the
Mm,
three points. Let's move on. They tell you a story and you're meant to get into the story and understand, well, what would you have done in that situation? And what are the right choices? And what are and see the
yeah.
complexity of all that. So I would want to point to the complexity of the Hebrew Bible. That would be the thing that a lot of people miss when they don't understand it.
It's showcasing that some of these prophets or some of these writers were perhaps wrestling with some of the things that were happening to them, and they're pondering, reflecting on what do we make of this? Why are we in this situation? And
Mm.
it's sort of asking the reader to sort of engage with that. I guess I wanted to ask you then, do we have any good examples where we see changes to the Hebrew that could change the actual meaning of the story?
Um, Yeah, that's right. There are cases where it's more a matter of nuance because I mean our English Bible translators aren't idiots. They know their Hebrew really well, so it's not like they've completely messed it up and missed the point. Every so often you get a Bible translation that's a little bit theologically motivated, and so they'll go this way rather than that way. Might add an extra word
Mm,
that gives you something like that. But generally, Bible translators are doing a pretty good job. The problem is, of course, when you come from one language to another, like different languages like Hebrew to English, you can't possibly reflect all the nuances and the subtleties of
yeah,
the
yeah.
language. You do occasionally get cases where, from my point of view, I think the grammar they could have understood it differently. Like my one of my favorite examples is in the book of the prophet Hosea, chapter 6, verse 1, often translated as something. There's a longer sentence, but often translated as like the Lord has torn us apart, in judgment, and he will heal us. But the grammar, as I understand it, the way that the verb and the conjunction work in that particular grammatical form, it's an in order that clause. So what Hosea is saying is the reason why God has judged you is not purely for judgment. It's in order to heal you. The Lord has
Mhm.
punished you in order, and I think that makes a really big difference of
Does.
nuance. It's not just this happened and this happened. It's
Yeah.
actually God's whole purpose in judgment is not because he likes punishing people, but in order that
Mm,
the people will understand, will and come back to understand and a better relationship with God, and therefore get the benefits from that relationship. So
right.
that's an example where it's a matter of nuance. There's nothing wrong with our translations, but I think you can get an extra nuance by looking
Sure.
at the Hebrew grammar.
And how long have you sort of been looking at the linguistic aspect to of the Bible?
I think as an area of research, already when I was doing my honest thesis as a student, and this is a real date, 1985. People were alive in 1985 when I was doing my honors in 1985. I started writing on the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Kohelet, as my honors
Yes.
thesis, and I wanted to talk about something completely different. I just wrote an
Mm,
introductory chapter about the language of Kohelet is weird and that proves that it's really late. And I
mm.
wanted to move on to the other chapters, but my thesis supervisor, Alan Crown, basically went, no, that's a little bit more complicated, and I've never got past that moment because it sort of steered me into
Yeah.
this. So that's how
Yeah.
long I've been looking
Wow. That's
as
amazing.
a research question. Yeah,
I really wanted to ask you about the linguistic dating. So, first of all, if you could just sort of unpack that,
yeah.
what is linguistic dating?
Yeah, so it makes sense from if we look at something from Shakespeare's time, then we can get an idea. We think, well, that's not modern English, right? And so we can get an
Mm,
idea. Well, it's probably written around 1600 or something like that, and we can trace that idea that languages change, and we can tell the difference between language in one period and what it looked like in another period. That's the basic idea, and that's obvious. All languages change, and quite often you can we've got enough information to be able to trace the development of languages in particular areas and particular ways. In regard to the Hebrew Bible, the argument has been along the lines of, well, there are certain books, like the Book of Esther or Daniel or something like that, that from their subject matter must have been written after the exile, after people have returned from the exile to Babylon. So let's say 500 BCE, 400 BCE, something like that. So we know some books have to be written there, and there's a group of books like that that share some peculiarities of language, and so the argument has been, oh, that's those peculiarities. That's what later Hebrew looked like, and when we've got a text like the book of Job, where, it's just sort of set, it may be set really early, but when was it actually written? You can
Yeah. Yeah.
look at Job and find a few, there's actually a few linguistic forms there that are shared with those late books. So I think that Job was written late. So
Mm.
that's kind of like the way the argument
Yeah.
has gone. That's the basic argument, and it's a reasonable argument, and it's logically thought out. Um,
Mm.
the problem that I and others have with it is that our sources really aren't good enough for us to be able to make those distinctions. Now, what I
Mm.
mean by that is, for Hebrew, we have very few dated and localized sources. What I mean by that is a source where we know definitely when it was written and where it was
Mm.
written, for example. So we have inscriptions, but the cor the corpus of all our inscriptions put together from the pre-exilic period, um, I think generously would be like 2, maybe 3% of the whole corpus of all the Hebrew we
Wow.
know. So tiny, tiny
Wow.
little amount. And that's
Yeah.
being generous because a lot of it's just like people's names and things like that, ration lists,
Mm.
all that sort of stuff there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we really don't know. Whereas in English, for example, we have tons of information. We have enough information to know what the dialect in Lincolnshire looked like in
Mm.
1228 or something like that. We have a
Abundance of
lot
it.
more
Yeah.
information.
Yeah.
So even in the ancient world, something like Greek or Akkadian, we have Akkadian letters that are dated for
Mm.
2,000 years. Hebrew, we just don't have those sort of sources, which is what historical linguists want when they're constructing a chronology of how the language is constructed. The sort of sources that historical linguists don't want are literary manuscripts, which is all we've got in the Hebrew
Mm.
Bible. Because the problem with
Yes.
literary manuscripts is whenever they're written, they've passed through multiple scribal hands. They've changed the language. And so what we have, for example, the book of Micah, it's a prophet Micah. We think
Yes.
Micah historically put him 700 BCE, but we can't say that the language of the current book of Micah is what, quite apart from other issues, is what Micah would have written in 700
Mm.
BCE,
Right.
because all our evidence indicates that ancient scribes didn't weren't
Pres-
careful about copying the specific linguistic forms that are used
yes.
in linguistic dating. And so if I wrote a text now and three other people rewrote it in the next 100 years, to what extent do you actually
Mm.
have my writing and my
Yeah.
language rather than that of somebody else? And so um, we have a lot of
Mm.
all of our evidence indicates that ancient scribes are not copying those, less common linguistic features
Mm.
that are not important to them, and even getting two parallel texts, like Psalm 18 is 2 Samuel 22, same two different
Mm.
places.
Yes.
There's
Yes.
almost none of these less common, unusual linguistic forms that turn up in both texts. They're the same
Right.
text, but
Yeah. Yeah.
scribes aren't copying the language carefully. So there's nothing wrong with the basic idea that languages change. Obviously,
Mm.
languages change, but the evidence we have in our late copies of biblical manuscripts is just not good enough for us to be
Mm.
able to make those sort of arguments. So probably every biblical text is a mixture of some early linguistic features, some late linguistic features,
Right. Right.
but we don't know enough outside of the
Mm.
Bible to have the pegs to say, oh, I know for sure that's an early form. I know for
Yes.
sure that's a
Yes.
later form. So that's some of the major big issues that for
Right.
me and for others mean that we don't think that linguistic dating can work.
Yeah, right, very, very interesting. So, but in terms of the linguistic dating itself, and excuse my ignorance because for me, it's a new field and I'm really interested to learn more about it. But does it focus on looking at the contents of the book and try to find any particular references to agreeable historical event? We ask about the dating of the Gospels, for example.
Mm.
Usually they give mark priority because of the reference to the destruction of the temple.
Yep.
And so therefore that's one aspect of dating that particular gospel, as opposed to carbon dating the actual manuscripts
Yeah.
or other methods that there is.
In terms of dating, yeah, there's a broader picture, but people who do linguistic dating will try to argue that language itself is basically a foolproof way of telling the date
Mhm.
of composition, quite apart from the contents of the text. Now, in reality, if you were looking at the date of a composition in the Hebrew Bible, you should be also looking for those other clues. Like, for example, if a text mentions the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, then
mm, mm.
that reference has got to be later than, unless it's a
Yes,
prophetic work, blah blah blah. But I mean,
sure.
they're coming later than that. But the linguistic dating, as it's done by those people who are very enthusiastic about it, they will claim that it is an objective way of dating a biblical text purely on its own, and that it trumps every other argument.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So is that the highest, I guess, the most reliable source of dating?
That's what they claim. I would say it's useless for dating.
Right,
So
right.
because of those particular reasons
That you mentioned.
that I
Yeah,
mentioned
right.
before.
Yes.
But so there's quite a distinction between what I would think and what other
Mm,
people think, and what people who are really involved with linguistic dating think. It's kind of
mm,
like they're two quite different. It's, in a sense, we can't talk to each other because our
mm,
understanding of the nature of the evidence is so different to each other.
mm.
So there's people who do linguistic dating quite often are much more positive about the idea that the text hasn't changed over time, but that just
Ah,
doesn't
right.
seem to match anything we know about the history of the biblical text.
And Ian, you mentioned that the evidence that we have suggests there has been layers of changing, and I don't want to say corruption, but I guess I'll use the word tampering. Do we have any internal evidence of manuscripts that have been changed in terms of its meaning or words, or whether they're insignificant or significant, whether they're intentional or unintentional?
Um, that's the nature of the Hebrew Bible and many ancient texts is what scholars call fluidity. That is now our actual physical evidence of biblical manuscripts only starts with the earliest Dead Sea Scrolls from like 200 BCE or something like that
Mm,
onwards.
mm,
And people are arguing these texts were composed however much earlier than that quite often. But when we start getting that evidence in those last centuries BCE, we have lots of evidence of of highly variant versions
mm,
of biblical books. One of the one of the classic examples, always people talk about, like the book of Jeremiah. The Greek translation is incredibly literal, a translation of a Hebrew text that seems to be about a sixth shorter. It has a lot
mm,
less headings in it. It's less organized. So the book of the Masoretic text, the traditional text of the that we get in Hebrew of the book of Jeremiah, is, as one scholar put it, a more edited version. Someone's taken more time to organize it
mm.
with headings, add extra information, like they'll more regularly say Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon,
Yes.
rather than just Nebuchadnezzar,
Mm,
Jeremiah the prophet, rather than just Jeremiah. They'll fill it out in those ways. There are whole extra sections, however, of prophecies that are not in the shorter version. So it's like it's attracted extra
mm.
material. My One of my major research areas is the book of Daniel, and even
Yes.
if you pick up two English Bibles these days, if you pick up Hebrew Bible or the Protestant Bible that's translated from it, it has 12 chapters. If you pick up the Catholic version of it, it has 14 chapters. And
Mm,
when you get into the textual history of Daniel, many of those in, like, for example, the so-called Old Greek translation seems to be translating quite a different version of the chapter than what we have. So I wouldn't say
oh, interesting.
I wouldn't say tampering, because it has that negative connotation. I
Yeah.
think the scribes have this. They wouldn't have thought of it as tampering. They would have thought that they needed to refocus and retell the
Mm,
stories to each new generation, and so the text continues to
okay.
grow. It
Progressively.
continues to attract related material. As I said, Jeremiah gets
Mm,
bigger, we think, more often than not.
yes.
Texts
Okay.
get bigger rather than shorter, and so on. So that's a
Yeah. Yeah.
rolling idea. Yeah.
So there's particular changes, but I guess the intention with behind the scribes is not necessarily let's change it towards to fit our theological agenda or political agenda. It's more so, I guess, out of goodwill, make certain changes. Not.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
maybe yeah, just to express bring out the ideas more clearly to
Okay. Yeah.
their. So in fact, um, these days we think, oh, we wouldn't change the Bible because that's a mark of respect for it. But in the
Mm,
ancient world, quite often people are changing the Bible out of respect because it's so important that they want it to be
mm,
clear to people. You do get
mm,
some cases where scholars have suggested there may be some sort of sectarian motivation. The the most one of the most famous variations
mm.
is the fact that the Samaritans have an extra commandment in the Ten Commandments. I mean, they count the others as nine, and they have a commandment. saying that you should worship God, build an altar on Mount Gerizim, which is their holy mountain.
Mm,
So
mm,
that seems like a Samaritan addition to the text. The complicating
yes.
factor is we have non-Samaritan manuscripts that seem to have the same variation. And so whether the
Mm,
Samaritans just took over a text that fitted, that worked for them,
mm,
or whether
yes.
whether it really is someone is actually changing the text for in order to achieve a theological purpose is actually not, even in that case,
Mm.
it's not absolutely clear what the motivation is.
All right, very interesting. It kind of reminded me of a book by John Kloppenborg on the a New Testament scholar who looked at the literary relationships that the Gospels have with each other, and he sort of concluded that Mark is the earliest Gospel, and then Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source. So there's some uniqueness there with Matthew and Luke, but there's also the Gospel Q. That's a sort of like a hypothetical construction. Well, is there anything similar to that within the Hebrew Bible, where there's somebody using a source for their writings, and then they sort of just either modified it or changed it in a way.
Yeah, that's right. There's so many conflicting theories among Hebrew Bible scholars, but the usual understanding is that the books of Chronicles are using some form of the book of Samuel and book of Kings as sources, and then but retelling the stories and putting them expressing the theology in a somewhat
Mm,
different way. And so that's a common idea, that those two, because they're covering very similar sort of ground historically, etc., like that. They'll cover that. So that's a very common idea, is that we've got Chronicles, in a sense, rewriting Samuel and Kings, not necessarily the version of Samuel and Kings that we now have in our Bible, but something like that.
mm,
Once you get beyond that, there are plenty of scholarly theories about hypothetical documents, like, for example, the idea that the first five books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are actually made up of earlier sources. That what we have is the bringing together, almost like a compromise document between different points of view. There, we don't have
mm,
those documents though, so it's highly theoretical, and I'm always cautious about being very confident about my ability to look at a text and go, "Oh, that
mm.
that verse was written on a Monday and that was written on a Wednesday," or something like. I'm being
Yeah, yeah,
flippant, but
yeah,
but
yeah.
nevertheless,
Understand.
I'm always not being very confident with that. But there are plenty of
Mm,
scholarly theories that sort of thing is going on all the time
right.
with the Gospels. I think we're lucky that we have Mark available for us to be able to look
Mm,
at it in comparison with Luke and Matthew. But from my understanding, I'm not a New Testament scholar. There are
yeah.
theories that the version of Mark they're using isn't the same as the version of Mark that we actually now have as Mark in our gospel. So that adds an
Mm,
extra level
hmm.
of complexity. But
Yeah.
as I said, I'm not a New Testament scholar, so don't quote me on that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. So you mentioned preservation and scribes, copying, making maybe perhaps copyist errors or numerical errors. There are passages in the Old Testament that seem almost identical.
Yep.
I think Chronicles and Second Kings, and then there's other passages that are referring to the same story or story of a king that have some sort of numerical errors with it. So it would say like he reigned for 23 years, and another book would have 42 years. So it seems like a clear numerical type of error.
Mm.
Um, how much evidence do we have of that within the manuscripts that exist today?
Yes, certainly. With numbers, especially, unless they're very significant in the text, you can understand how
Hmm.
you could either consciously on or unconsciously swap them over because they don't make a huge difference
Yeah.
to you. We've got a parallel list of returned exiles in Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of variance, often in the way the names are rendered and things like that. And you can, but quite often it is, it's saying from this family, 2,333 people returned from exile. But the other
Hmm.
text, even a parallel text in the Masoretic text of two books next to each other, the numbers don't match with each other. So you'd have to
Hmm.
think, in a case like that, I can't think of a really strong motivation for consciously changing the numbers. So
Hmm.
it may well just be the natural sort of, the nature of the difficulty of properly copying numbers,
Hmm.
and something 100 drops out here or something along those lines.
Or
Yeah.
You were saying that the Dead Sea Scrolls are roughly dated, you'd say around 200 BC,
Yeah,
around
starting
that.
from around about 250 BC, and I would date the deposit in the caves in the pre-Christian era. Other people put them, say they put in the caves around about 68 AD, 68 CE. I would put it a little bit earlier, but the last
Mm,
centuries BCE is where I would place the Dead Sea Scrolls and our
yeah.
earliest physical copies of biblical manuscripts. Yeah, scholars will date things all over the place, and I would
Mm,
emphasize that since biblical books were written and then rewritten over time, what we now have is a mixture of earlier and later. So even to ask what is the date of a biblical book is asking the wrong question, because the answer is it early? Yes. Is it late? Yes. Is it from the middle? Yes. They're all right. Parts
mm,
of it are coming from different periods, and the book itself has changed over time. We it's difficult to go too far beyond our attested sources to infer what an earlier version, like, I mean, we've got a manuscript of Samuel is usually considered to be our earliest biblical manuscript. But what did the book of Samuel look like 200 years earlier,
mm.
300 years earlier? If we had a Dead Sea Scrolls discovery from the 5th century BCE, I think it would blow our minds in the same
Yes,
way that
yes,
discovering the Qumran scrolls blew our minds as well.
absolutely.
Typically, in historical critical work, have wanted to write a history of Israelite religion. And therefore, you want to know what this is the earlier source. It developed into this source, it
Mm,
developed into this one, and so on. But I don't think our evidence allows us to do that. We just have this fluidity, and what we have to be content with is looking at the attested evidence that we actually have, rather than arguing back, I don't know, 500 years earlier
sure.
than that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. So, for example, the first five books of Moses,
yeah,
um, generally considered from a, I guess, a textual critical point of view, that they're not written by Moses himself, but written about Moses. And so, like, Book of Job is written about Job or about Judith, not necessarily by Judith, right?
yep.
It must have been probably drawing on, I guess, either oral traditions at the time. Do you think?
Yeah, that's right. So there are yeah, there is this idea that yeah, there would be traditions. Depends what you think about the historical Moses, but I mean
Hmm.
the books themselves, especially Deuteronomy, but not only Deuteronomy, um, are actually putting in a lot of effort to say that Moses didn't write them. There's this constant repeated mention in the beginning and the end of the book that this is Moses is meant to be speaking in Deuteronomy, and then there is an editorial note saying, and it is so to this day.
Mm.
That's actually very explicitly saying there is a distance in time between us and Moses. I'm not completely clear why Deuteronomy wants to do that,
Mm.
but there's this repeated mention, and obviously at the end of the book, it describes Moses' death and says no one has arisen like him to this day, and that
Yes.
seems to be an evident. There seems to be some passage of time where we're looking back to Moses and we're saying, well, nobody like him has
Mm.
arisen. That would be a weird thing to write, even if it's written by like Joshua, his successor, 5 minutes after his death. That's a little bit premature to make that sort of judgment.
Mm.
But even in other places in the Bible, there are some of these in those, like, I mean, the Canaanites were in the land in those days, implying that there is some length of time that's developed. So ancient people thought of authorship in a different way. So that
Mm.
we need to, yeah, as you said, think about these books. People will still refer to them as the books of Moses, and even say that Moses wrote them. But when people are
Yes.
talking about Moses wrote them, our evidence for ancient authorship would be that they conceived it as in a different way. It could be Moses can be like the head of the tradition that leads to all these other
Oh,
things
I
that are being
see.
written in his name, etc.
Yes.
Get that
Yes.
problem a
Yes.
lot in the book of Daniel as well. The idea that it's a Daniel, it's a discourse
Inspired.
about, yeah, it's about Daniel, or it's a type
Mm.
of literature. If you write something in the name of Daniel, it follows
Mm.
this one. You write it in the name of Enoch, it's got this particular trend. So you can
Mm.
use authorship quite often as a way of indicating, oh, this is the sort of literature that I'm writing. That
Yeah.
I'm going
Right.
to write an Enoch sort of apocalypse or something like that, and therefore I
Mm.
write it in the name of Enoch.
In terms of the different genres of the Hebrew Bible, with law and the prophets and the wisdom and poetry and all, do you feel like there is a genre of fiction in there?
Yeah, I think that I think there is a good case that some of the biblical stories are fictional, and also, but also that even when they're talking about a historical person or an event, they will still quite often embellish the story in ways that we would more associate with fiction than our idea of how you would write history. You know, they'll write a dramatic story, put a speech in somebody's mouth, etc., like that, even with something that we know is historical. But there are other texts there where there's a strong case. Like, I mean, the traditional Masoretic text of Esther has some very specific dates when it says that Esther is queen, and our other sources seem to imply somebody else is queen of Persia at that
Mm,
particular time. Um, but there are, and I think something when we're getting outside the Hebrew Bible, like the Book of Judith, starts with in when talk this is about when Nebuchadnezzar was king of the Assyrians. Now, immediately anyone knows anything about the biblical tradition knows that Nebuchadnezzar was not the king of the
mm,
Assyrians, and so that's kind of like the author saying, just so that you know, this is the sort of story that I'm going to tell you.
mm,
It may be, it may have some historical bits to it, but I'm going to embellish them. I'm going to tell you things that are not, and maybe probably the category history in our sense wouldn't have been in their head anyway, but they're just
mm,
indicating to you. They start off with a statement that makes you go, what? Oh, okay, now I
mm,
know what I'm reading. And I think there's a number of works like that that start with a statement that seems historically very difficult, you know,
mm.
but I think the aim is not that the author didn't have a vaguest clue about biblical history. They actually wanted to indicate, I'm writing that sort of literature.
So the intention of the writer himself would be
Yep,
this is a not necessarily historically accurate story, but and
correct.
the audience would have picked up on that obviously because they would
Mm.
have known there was an issue.
Yeah, I think so, and I think
Yeah. Okay.
even if we've got something that maybe somewhere has some historical core, the historical core is so difficult for us
Mm,
to identify that what we have in front of us is more what we would consider fiction or historical fiction rather than a factual story. But as I said,
mm,
those categories blur into each other. You know, when we have we know for sure there was a King Hezekiah and that he was attacked by the Assyrians because we have extensive Assyrian sources
mm,
talking about the same thing. But when the Book of Kings is talking about Hezekiah, it's giving us stuff which is basically historical, but the way it presents Hezekiah as a character, his development, etc., is very what we'd call fictionalized. I'm not saying he didn't develop like that, but the way the
mm,
story is told is using techniques that we would more think of as a way of telling a fiction rather than our you've got to get be strictly
mm.
factual way of telling history. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I forgot to ask you about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Apparently, the only book that wasn't part of that compilation is the Book of Esther.
Yes,
Uh,
that's right.
uh,
That yeah.
is there a particular reason as to why that was?
It's very I think it's tricky to know whether we don't have Esther because whoever was responsible for these collections that came together here just didn't like Esther, or whether it's purely by accident that we don't have it, right? So
Mm,
um, for the book of because remember we've got a few really well preserved Dead Sea Scrolls, and people look at them and go, all the Dead Sea Scrolls must be like that, but we have somewhere over 900, maybe getting towards the 1,000 literary manuscripts. It's hard to know how many because many of them are just preserved in tiny little scraps. We
mm,
have only one copy of the Book of Chronicles, if I recall, and Chronicles has about 24,000 Hebrew words in it. I think we have, including partially preserved words, maybe 24 words of Chronicles. So
wow.
1,000th of the book survived
Mm,
one copy. That's only one very hungry worm away from having no copies of the Book of Chronicles,
yeah,
which is much
yeah,
bigger than Esther. And we
yeah.
so it may well be that there is some secret deep, dark reason why Esther isn't there, or Judith isn't there, for example. We think it was
Mm,
probably written in Hebrew as well, or the Book of Maccabees, for example, first Book of Maccabees.
mm.
So it might be that they thought that they were putting forward the wrong sort of ideas, but it
Maybe
could. It's
political or
always
theological agenda, perhaps?
yeah,
Maybe?
one Maccabees is propaganda for the Hasmonean dynasty, the priest kings who reigned in Israel from about 150 to 50 BCE in very round
Mm,
numbers there. So you could imagine that you were if the people who were collecting it were not too keen on the Hasmoneans, they could have left that one out there.
Mm.
Esther, they might have not liked the Feast of Purim, so they might have kicked that one out as well.
Yeah,
I don't know
right.
what anyone would have against Judith, but
Lots,
maybe they didn't like women. I don't know. Yeah.
man, lots of different theories out there.
A lot
Yeah.
there always with
Uh,
scholarship there are a lot of theories because I mean bottom line is what do we actually have
mm,
and what evidence do we have, and we can say things very definitely on about this manuscript has this in it and it is different from this other manuscript that we
mm,
have. Once you get beyond that, then we don't know, because that is the nature with all ancient history is
mhm,
we
mhm,
have certain areas that have a big light on them and large areas of history where we know almost nothing, and
mm.
we got like three dots of information and someone makes a star out of it, another person makes a triangle out of it.
Yeah, yeah,
How do you
absolutely.
put all those things together?
Oh, yeah. Is there any particular book in the Hebrew Bible that if you look at it from, a literature perspective rather than history, does it change the meaning of the book?
I th because I'm kind of reading everything from a literary point of view, first of all, anyway, because I think it's
Okay.
being presented in that way. But I think it will make you less anxious about pushing the book to be one particular thing. Like there's a lot of in the book I study a lot, Daniel, there are some scholars who are coming from a particular theological tradition where for the Bible to be God's word, it needs to be historical in every single detail.
Mm,
Which
mm,
that I don't know where that's written, but anyway,
mm,
that's what they have, and therefore they have to make everything in Daniel and the stories about Daniel
mm,
historical, and
mhm.
that's creates an anxiety for them where they spend a lot of
Yes.
time dealing with that. Whereas if you're willing to think that, well, it's a literary presentation, there may well have been a historical Daniel behind the tradition, but the
Mhm,
presentation itself is trying to tell us things, and it's more important what the tradition is trying to tell you than the historical core behind it. It just changes your approach to it, changes your research priorities, makes you less anxious about the text,
mhm.
and maybe I would say more open to what the text is actually trying to achieve rather than I don't think the text is trying to be, massively historical or something like that.
Do you think you could point to a particular book that probably has the most amount of, I guess, development within it?
I would say that it's the nature of the tradition. The tradition itself, maybe some Christian theologians would say the tradition itself is the word of God rather than like there's an original revelation to Moses and anything after that
Mm,
is a corruption. But it comes it comes down to what do we actually have attested. So for some books we have more evidence and therefore we can trace different stages of development,
mm,
and other books we just don't have it. So for example, the Little Book of Ruth, for example, I'm not aware of
mm,
any really major different versions of the Book of Ruth, but that doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't one. It just means that we haven't. It didn't happen to turn up in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what the ancient Greek translation translated was quite similar to our text, and so you can definitely trace, with just talking about my books like Jeremiah or Daniel that I've already spoken about, we happen to have a number of different sources of information, and whenever we discover more information, we tend to see different ways that the tradition has been presented. So the if we had a book with a lot of information, we'd probably think it developed more than others. But I would suspect that all the books are developing and in different ways as well.
mm,
Each book has its own history. So I would be, yeah, I wouldn't be willing to say this one definitely developed more than others, but I
mm,
could say we have more evidence of development for this one just by the way it's been um, it's been preserved. Like as I said
mm,
with Daniel, because we have these multiple. We actually have two Greek translations of it, which are quite ancient. We have the traditional Masoretic text of it, and they're already quite different to each other. And then we have various editings
mm,
of the various Greek traditions, and so you could say we have five different editions of the book of Daniel, for example. That's purely
mm,
our good luck. With Esther, we have two quite different Greek versions of it, which are quite different to the Hebrew version of Esther. So there we could say we have three versions of. Oh, actually, there's more of that, more for Esther as
mm,
well. But I think it comes down to what are the accidents of discovery? Because I mean, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have some quite variant versions of the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon,
Yes,
where
yes,
some of them seem to be quite a lot shorter than what we have in our
yes.
Bible. They're being re-edited in various different ways.
Mm,
But the tradition, the Greek translation of Song of Songs is pretty close to our traditional Masoretic text. So if we
mm.
didn't happen to discover that cave at Qumran, we'd never know
Wouldn't
that
know
there were
that.
these variant versions
Yes,
of it. So
yes.
once again, you're getting my
Mm.
usual frustrating "we don't know" answer, but I think it,
No,
I
that's
think
that's very fair. No, of course.
yeah.
And amongst those Dead Sea Scrolls, were some of the books in different order, rearranged differently?
Um, yeah, definitely. One of the features of the Book of Jeremiah uh, that we have actually that's more from the Greek translation.
Mm.
That we know that the oracles against the foreign nations in our traditional Masoretic text are at the end of the book, and they're in the middle of the
Right.
Greek version
Okay.
of it. In Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, it's often harder to tell because they're often small fragments, and so we don't
Yeah.
get the continuous. Because we often
Yes.
look at it, because when they had these tiny fragments, the first generation of scholars were really dependent on what we have in the Hebrew Bible to help
Mm.
them to sort it out and put them in the way. And often scholars now are going back and looking at them and saying, well, actually, they're more variant than we thought because the scholars just naturally related them to what we knew. But in
Mm.
when we actually have a fragment where we actually have the sequence preserved, I know there's a famous case in the book of Joshua where in the Qumran, one of the Qumran scrolls, they cross the Jordan and then they build an altar to the Lord. Whereas in the Masoretic text and the Greek version, they cross the Jordan, and it's 5 chapters before they build this
Oh,
this
right.
this altar.
Okay.
So that would seem to imply,
Mm.
quite apart from the question of which is an earlier text, etc., like that, that would at least implies that there were two ways of telling this story in Joshua. When chronologically did they build this altar? Was it straight after they crossed the Jordan? Was it
Mm.
that's like chapters 3 and 4? This is the beginning of chapter 5, maybe, or
Mm.
as in the
Yeah.
Masoretic text at the end of chapter 8, for
Yeah.
example. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but that's the problem because we only have small sections. The Dead Sea Scrolls themselves only give us hints about different orderings of
Mm.
within books because we don't have enough evidence of large for most books of larger sort of groupings of text.
Yeah. And they're very fragile too. I mean, not all of the books have scrolls, right? Some of them are very fragmentary. It's
Most of them are very fragmentary,
most of
actually.
them. Okay,
Yeah.
wow. Right.
So to give you an idea, let's say we have, because we never know exactly how many manuscripts we have, because scholars are constantly going, oh, that tiny fragment, we put them together, but actually they're probably two different scrolls. So,
Mm.
really, but let's say we have 230 of the manuscripts that are books that are copies of books that are in our Hebrew Bible. So the majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls are not Hebrew Bible books; they're
Mm.
other religious books. But
Mm.
let's say there's 230 of those that are biblical manuscripts. Already, only 108 of them, less than half, have 50 or more words fully or partially preserved. So that's only 50 words.
Wow.
Then you get down to, I think there are only 6 manuscripts that have 1,000 words or more. And I'm saying like something like Chronicles has like 24,000 words. So even 1,000 words is
Mm.
only a fragment of the whole book. We
Yeah.
only have
Yeah.
the big Isaiah scroll that gets, that's a pin-up boy for everybody. That one's
Mm.
pretty much fully preserved.
Yes.
The
Yes.
second best biblical manuscript preserved from Qumran is another copy of Isaiah, and it has less than 20% preserved. So that's the
Wow.
second best preserved
Wow.
manuscript.
Less than
They
20%.
less, and that's number two. That's one of our
Wow.
that's right at the top there. And you can
Right.
imagine how fragmentary some of these
Yes.
manuscripts are, with just a small number of words, like a
Oh,
little fragment here and a little like a little
okay.
window we're looking through. We can only imagine what the rest of the text might have looked like.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. I had no idea. I didn't know the second most preserved was only 20%.
Yep.
Second most. Wow.
Yep.
Okay. And
So that
amongst those books, you mentioned that there was some other
mm.
books like the Wisdom of Ben Sira.
Correct, that's right. Yeah, so
Yeah.
we can on top of the Hebrew Bible books, we have copies of books that we knew from other traditions. Like, I mean, we have manuscripts of the Book of Enoch that I was mentioning
Hmm.
earlier. Some Aramaic fragments of Enoch,
Yes.
bits of Ben
Yes.
Sira, as you said, which is in the Catholic
Yes.
Bible as well. But on top of that, there's a whole pile of other compositions that
Hmm.
we'd never heard of before, and some of them. in cave one, they were very careful about putting them like in pots and wrapping them, so they're quite well preserved. That's where they get the Isaiah scrolls
Mm.
from. Um, but so we like have like what they call the community rule, which is like this document about describing how a particular religious community should operate or something like
Mm.
that. And that's mostly preserved. We have other copies of that from other caves where they're very fragmentary and they represent different editions. But then we have other, and so they're all these
Mm.
those texts we never knew them elsewhere. And then we have other texts that are kind of like, I don't know, the people are writing basically, I don't know, fan fiction about the Bible or different versions of
Oh,
it,
right, right,
things
okay.
like that. So we get, but they're often very tiny. I like to read, when I read Dead Sea Scrolls with my students, we get used to it by reading some of the better preserved scrolls. And then I give them,
Yes,
well, then we
yes.
read something that is three small fragments. And
Mm.
the question is, are they even from the same scroll as
Mm.
each other? And they're from a composition that we don't know anywhere else.
Wow.
So we've got a few words on one fragment, a few words on another, and almost
Mm.
nothing on the third one. And the question is, what do we make out of that? It's a fragment of a larger composition.
Wow.
We don't know what it was. It mentions the angel Michael. It mentions King Zedekiah from the Bible.
Mm.
People say, oh, they're making a covenant, but as some of my students annoyingly point out, the word covenant is only reconstructed by scholars. You maybe see the first letter of it or something like that. So
Yes, yes,
that's an
yes.
interesting exercise for students to do.
Absolutely. Because they could be
Um,
from any other books. I mean, it's difficult to tell where do these fragments fit. It's like a jigsaw
exactly.
puzzle,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, what was the book about? Just because we have one passage that's
Yeah,
about
that's
Michael and
wow.
Zedekiah, so there's a lot of those sort of compositions where we're kind of
Yeah,
guessing what they might have even been about.
yeah, yeah,
We've got that. Imagine you rip one corner out of a book, and you say, okay, what
yeah,
was that book about?
yeah, yeah.
How
It
would
could
you
be
name it?
anything, really. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
that's fascinating. You mentioned the Masoretic texts. Are they more preserved than the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, so the traditional Masoretic text is what you'd get even in a modern Hebrew Bible. Pick up any Hebrew Bible, that's the traditional Masoretic text, and that's based on um, manuscripts, many manuscripts from the last 1,000 years, which are fully preserved. Masoretic text is
Mm.
the only fully preserved copy we have of the Hebrew Bible. And so, and then if you go back, there's a codex called the Leningrad Codex, or if you're not
Mm.
communist, St. Petersburg
Yes,
Codex,
yes,
which is our earliest complete copy of the whole Bible,
yes.
all the books together. Before that, we have copies of the Masoretic text that have got this missing and that missing, etc.
Mm.
So I'm not saying there aren't earlier texts than that, but that's from around about 1000 AD, 1000 CE, that Leningrad Codex. And so earlier than that, we have plenty of biblical manuscripts, but they get more and more fragmentary as you go
Mm.
back in time. So
Back,
the
okay.
Masoretic text has been known, and any medieval manuscript that you get is a version of the Masoretic text. None, they're manuscripts, so no two manuscripts are exactly letter perfect the same as each other, but they're
Mm.
very, very, very similar to each other.
And is that Leningrad Codex is that contain all the Hebrew books or Hebrew Bible
Yeah,
books? Okay.
that's right. Anything you get in a printed Hebrew Bible would be found in the Leningrad. That's it. That's its claim to fame. It's
Mm.
the earliest copy that hasn't got anything missing, no pages missing or anything like that. The whole manuscript. Yeah.
Yeah. If somebody's interested to learn more about the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew language itself,
Yep.
do you have any, I guess, advice for somebody that wants to pursue that? And what kind of any recommendations that you might have?
Yeah. If you're able to attend a university course or another college course, etc., either as a student who's enrolled at the university, or sometimes universities have sort of education programs where you can sort of get involved with a course, or there are local communities sometimes that put on
Mm.
this course. It's always depending on how you learn languages, then it's usually easier to learn with other people, with an instructor who really knows what they're doing and knows how to present it. So I'm an Australian Catholic university. We're the only university in Australia with a full program in classical Hebrew.
Mm.
And so you can go from beginners level, you can do and then a couple of years of more senior level um,
Yeah.
Hebrew here. So that's a full program. I'd also I mean, this is me being me, but once you get the Hebrew under your belt, it's always worth learning Aramaic and
Aramaic,
other
yeah,
language
yeah,
like
yeah.
that, and keep going with
Oh,
learning languages.
absolutely. After all these years of your research in in the field, what's keeping you interested in the Hebrew Bible?
Think there's a couple of things. One is that just other people are very interested in the topic, and so other people being interested, I pick up on their energy and I give it and I give it back to them because I can tell them something that they go, oh wow, I didn't know that before. As you know,
Mm,
that's just exciting being able to tell people, guide people, that sort of teaching angle, or just talking to people like yourself or
mm,
anyone
mm.
who would be listening to what I do on YouTube or anything like that. Just introducing
Yes.
people to those new ideas. But ever since I was a kid, I've loved ancient history more generally, and so
Yeah.
I like the I like the Bible. I do a lot of research on certain parts of the Bible, but I'm also very interested more broadly. I read generally in ancient
Mm,
Near East, ancient history, Greek history, Roman history. I
mm.
just love ancient history. I just love putting
Yeah.
this bit together with that, and this is what's happening at this time. And I just I don't know. I think I just naturally am enthusiastic about that, and that's
Yeah.
because I'm
Brilliant.
cool, right? Because and I'm not a geek. I am cool
100,
because I'm very interested.
absolutely. Oh, absolutely. That's brilliant. No, I love that. That's fascinating. And like I said, I could probably sit here for days just asking you questions. And look, I've learned a lot of things from this interview, right away. So I'm sure the audience would benefit from this, and they'll much enjoyed it a lot, I think. Who knows? Maybe a part two. Maybe let's see how it goes.
The sequel. That's right.
The
Yeah, that's for
sequel,
sure.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
No, yeah, Ian, thank you so much for your time. We'll definitely keep in touch.
excellent. Thank you.